Cinderella promised gladly that she would leave the ball before midnight. Then she spoke to the driver, he flicked the reins, and the coach went plunging off. The horses pranced and tossed their plumes, and the footmen sat up so straight they almost fell over backwards. It was a brave sight, and word traveled ahead that some great princess must be approaching. When they arrived at the palace and Cinderella stepped from her coach, it was the king's son himself who greeted her. He had a little speech thought up, one that he had used before on princesses. But when he saw how beautiful she was, every word of it went right out of his head. He gave her his arm and led her up the steps to the palace and down the long halls into the ballroom. The moment they entered, everything stopped. Everyone turned to look at them. It was as if Cinderella's beauty had cast a spell over the whole court. Then the music started. Still no one moved. They all just stood there watching. The prince looked down at Cinderella, and Cinderella looked up at the prince. And then she smiled, and without a word he took her in his arms, and they danced. If you're in love, you'll know. Your heart will tell you so. If there is just the tiniest doubt, ask your heart, for hearts can figure it out. Are you having a good time? Asked the prince. Wonderful, said Cinderella. Then run with all your might. It's a lovely evening, said the prince. Lovely, said Cinderella. May I have the next dance? Asked the prince. And the one after that? And the one after that? So it went all evening. The prince never took his eyes off her, and Cinderella, she was floating on air. But suddenly, when the party was at its height, a clock struck. She stopped to listen. 12:15. Oh, I must go, she cried. Oh, stick around, said the prince. Gosh! But Cinderella curtsied hastily and hurried off across the dance floor. As she was leaving, she heard the prince call for silence and shout, "Everybody back tomorrow night!" When the prince threw a party, he really threw one. Fortunately, Cinderella reached home just as the clock struck 12, and when her sisters arrived, they found her in rags as usual, rubbing her eyes as if she'd been asleep. They kept her awake half the night, telling her of the unknown princess, how beautiful she was and how kind she had been to them. When Cinderella finally did get to sleep, she fell to dreaming. And guess what she dreamed of? Yeah. The next evening, everything happened just as before. Remember, said the fairy godmother, you must stay at the ball not a second after midnight. When Cinderella arrived at the palace, the prince was waiting eagerly. He'd been waiting, in fact, since about 4 in the afternoon. He shoved aside the footman and swept her from the coach, and the two of them ran laughing up the steps together. All evening while they danced, the prince poured pretty compliments into her ear. He was one of those divine dancers women talk of. And as Cindy drifted about the floor with him, she forgot her home, her stepmother, her cruel sisters, and even her fairy godmother. She forgot everything. She was in a pink mist. But suddenly, oh my goodness, 12 o'clock. She turned and ran across the slippery dance floor, down the long halls, with the prince after her. Wait! Wait! But she didn't wait. She dashed out the door and down the steps. Halfway down, one of her glass slippers flew off. The prince stopped to pick it up, and that was the last he saw of her. When he reached the curve where her coat should have been, all he found was a battered old pumpkin and some mice skittering down the gutter. Days passed, and still no sign. The prince decided he would advertise, so he rigged up a contest. He announced that he would personally marry any girl whose foot would fit the glass slipper, and he sent a man around from house to house with a free offer to try it on. The prince well knew there was only one foot in the entire kingdom, tiny and delicate enough to fit that little slipper. But no one else knew that, and every woman under 50 had a go at it, even Cinderella's sisters. They tugged and they squeezed. Oof! See! but it was no use. Finally, they had to give up. Then Cinderella said shyly, "Let me try." "Oh, for heaven's sake," said the sisters. But the man with the slipper insisted that the offer was open to all. He had her sit down. She put out her dainty foot, and he tried the slipper. And behold, it fitted as if it had been made for her, which it had. Well, sir, you could have knocked her sisters over with a feather. And if I had been there, I would have done it. They simply couldn't believe their eyes. But just so there might be no mistake, the fairy godmother suddenly appeared from nowhere and touched Cinderella with her magic wand. And in a twinkling, she was revealed as the beautiful princess. But when the prince heard she was found, he was so happy he declared this an ideal occasion for a grand ball, to be followed immediately by another announcing their engagement, and one after that celebrating their marriage. Some say the festivities lasted altogether 7 days, and you may be sure there was plenty of dancing.